It's time to make it. Just give it a try. 'Cause you can make it like the old fat guy.
Welcome to this episode of You Can Make It with David Farrell, the old fat guy. Today we're going to do something in our smoker. Now often I do recipes that you can do in the smoker or the oven. Today's recipe is for a full packer brisket, and you got to do this recipe in your smoker. So if you've just been doing ribs and the occasional cut of pork in your smoker, or maybe a piece of chicken, today we're going to do a brisket, which is the sign of a true pitmaster. I'm going to show you the basic way to do a really good brisket in your smoker. So the first thing you need is a brisket. This is called the full packer brisket. It's got two muscles that make it up. There's a nice lean piece that runs along here that has grain that runs that way, more or less towards the right. And then there's the point, which is a big, thick, fatty muscle that lies under this part of it that has a grain that runs this way and is not as lean and is much more marbled with fat and makes what they call fatty cuts. So the thing with a brisket is it's not like a fancy roast you buy in the store. It comes as a big slab of meat from the factory, and it usually requires some trimming. So I suggest you put it lean side up. You'll see there's a fat side and a lean side. And you want to make sure that the edges are not rough and ugly like this is. This edge is pretty good, except for a fat area. So we're going to start off by cutting off this ugly edge along here. And we're going to do that by just taking a really sharp knife and cutting about 1/4 of an inch off of this edge. There we go. There we go, a nice smooth edge. Now, quite often this edge from the factory isn't too bad, just this one's a little rough, so we're going to cut it off. So there we go, we got a nice smooth edge to deal with here. Now you can use these trimmings to make sausage or any other project you have that you want to grind some fatty meat into. So now that we've got that edge pretty good, the next edge we're going to look at is this one. Now there's a little thin part here. Now that thin part will quite often cook up quite tough because it is so thin. So you just want to cut it up to the thicker part. And we'll just keep cutting through till we get that to a nice bit thicker piece of lean beef. Now we have the other edge. Now the problem with this edge is that it's a little rough there and there's this big fatty piece along here. So I'm going to just trim this a bit just to get a nice clean edge. There we go. Now this fatty piece of the point, quite often there's a big hunk of fat here that you have to cut off. We don't have to, this one was cut off in the factory, but if there's a big thick piece of fat there, trim it down until you see the meat like that. Now you'll see this fatty, ugly section along here. We don't want that. That's just not pretty. It's not going to be a nice cut of meat on the plate. So we're just going to cut it down so that it's a nice smooth edge. There we go. That looks a little bit better. So now we want to start trimming up the fat. What you're trying to accomplish is to expose only meat and not fat on this surface, because that gives you a really flavorful, crisp part of the brisket they call the bark. And you want a lot of dark bark because that gives a lot of great flavor. So you'll see this hunk of fat here. Just take it off. There we go, and you just take it down until you start to see some beef. There we go. So now we got mostly beef along there. That's what we're looking for. There we go. And then there's a little bit of fat along there, but that's the division, and you're just going to leave that. You're looking for this surface. Now if we go back to this other edge, you'll see there's a big thick hunk of fat here. Well, you don't want that. So just cut that off. Remember, on this side, you want to get down to a surface of beef. See that there's a nice surface of beef there, but then you still got this piece of fat. Just keep trimming it off a little bit at a time until you get down to beef. There we go, and we'll just give it another cut down there. And one more slice should do it. And there you go. You can see beef all along there and beef all along there. And we'll just cut that little tip of meat off there to make it nice and smooth. And remembering what I said, what you want up here is as much beef showing. So you'll have these little pieces of fat and silver skin. You want to cut them off. So there's a little bit here. We'll just slowly cut through it. Now you won't get rid of all of this because it's a seam, but just try and get it down to a nice smooth surface, just like that. And then we want to take all of this fat and silver skin, just slowly slice it off to get it down to a surface of only beef. Now we'll just keep cutting through that silver skin. There we go. Now you don't have to worry about leaving a little bit of it behind. It will cook off. But if you get a place like this where it's a little down, just put your hand underneath it and lift it up and cut that off. Just a little bit at a time. And there's a big piece there. Just cut it off. There we go. And there's a little bit left there, so I'll put my hand underneath that and just lift it up and slowly cut it off. There we go. Nice beef showing there. Last bit is a little bit there. That's not enough to worry about, so we'll just take this off of here. Turn it around is convenient for you. It's sometimes a little bit easier to cut the other way. There we go. So we've got most of the silver skin and the fat off of this beef side. Now, you'll watch a lot of videos and a lot of books that'll tell you to trim this fat on this side down to 1/4 of an inch. If you're going into a competition, you do that because you want it to look perfect. At home, it just doesn't matter. You can leave that on. It's called the fat cap. And just leave it the way it is, and it'll be fine. If you want to make it look real pretty, you can try and trim it down to 1/4 of an inch. But for just home use, I wouldn't bother. So we'll flip it back. Oh, excuse me, we'll actually just leave it like that for a second. Now, the next thing we're going to do is put a rub on our brisket. Now, we're going to be using a very simple, basic brisket rub, my favorite. And what we're going to do is we're going to mix together 15 milliliters of ground pepper, 9 milliliters of kosher salt, 9 milliliters of beef base, just the stuff you use to make a cup of broth, the powder that comes in a jar, 9 milliliters of paprika, 9 milliliters of onion powder, and 9 milliliters of garlic powder. So just put all of them in a bowl. There we go. And just mix it up. There we go. Now we're going to put half of the rub over the fatty side. Just rub it in there, pat it down. And the reason we're doing the fatty side is it's not the display side and it'll kind of muck up. So then we'll flip it over to the nice meat side and we'll put the other half of the rub over the meat side. And we're just going to rub that in. Looks beautiful. I wish you could smell this rub. It's just got great bouquet and flavor, so just get it all over the surfaces there. And there we've put a rub on our brisket. Now, it takes about 1 hour and 10 minutes per pound of brisket to cook. And this is about a 12-pound brisket, so it's going to take roughly 14 hours to cook, which means I'm going to be getting up at 4 in the morning to put this thing on the smoker. Actually 3:30 because I got to preheat the smoker. So what I'll be doing until then is I'll just be putting this on a tray and putting it in the fridge where it will sit until I'm ready to fire it on a 230-degree smoker, and I'll see you about 4 o'clock this morning. I got up at 3:30 this morning and fired up my smoker to 230 degrees Fahrenheit. And I've put the brisket in the smoker, and you'll note I put it in fat side down. There's quite a controversy about whether it should be fat side down or fat side up. I find that fat side up tends to let the fat go over it, but doesn't give you as good a bark because the lean meat's down towards the fire. If I'm going to be foiling my meat, which we're going to be doing with this, I prefer to cook mine fat side down, which the fat cap protects the meat, but still gets a really beautiful bark on the top. So I put the fat side down. Now I'm going to let this cook to an internal temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, we're going to bring it inside and foil it. And every hour between now and then, I'm just going to give it a quick spritz with apple juice. That liquid on the surface gives a little bit of sweetness, which helps the bark. And smoke is water soluble, so it gives a stronger smoky flavor, and a nice barbecue ring will show around, nice smoke ring will show around the meat when it's cooked. So this will go for a few more hours to get to 160 degrees Fahrenheit and the internal temperature of the roast, and I'll see you then. The brisket sat out in the smoker for about 4 hours to get to an internal temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. It'll vary a little bit in time either side from that. So now what we want to do is wrap the brisket in foil. This does two things. It gets us to the last part of the cooking more quickly, and it lets us put some liquid in to get the brisket really, really tender. So what we're going to do is just take the brisket now, and I've got here 2 big sheets of aluminum foil. And I'm just going to put the brisket in the center of them, like that, and we're going to wrap it up. Now, just bring it together, fold it over. Nice, snug package. Just like that. Okay, and then we're going to go to one end and start folding it over onto the brisket. There we go. Now, before you seal it up though, we want to introduce some liquid. So what I have here is 3/4 of a cup or 175 milliliters of beef broth and 50 milliliters or 1/4 of a cup of soy sauce. And I'm just going to go down to this open end here, and I'm going to pour the liquid in. There we go. And then we're going to fold that up. Now you want to get the foil right mushed up against the meat, because that keeps the broth against the meat and adds some more flavor. There we go. Okay, now I'm just going to take this, and at this point you can finish it in your smoker at 230 degrees, but it's not going to get any more smoke on it because it's wrapped in foil. So what I'm going to do is actually finish this in the oven, because it's a cold day out there and it's a little cheaper to run the oven than my pellet smoker. So I'm going to put this in a 230 degree oven, but you can carry on in your 230 degree smoker just as well. How long it will take to cook exactly varies. I'm going to keep checking the internal temperature in it until it gets to around 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you just start putting a probe in until the probe goes in just like you were pushing it into room temperature, or excuse me, refrigerator butter. It should just go right in very easily, and then it's done. That'll be an internal temperature between 203 and 207. Sadly, no two pieces of beef cook the same, and I cannot tell you exactly how long that'll take. But it won't be a problem for dinner, and I'll show you why that is later. So, I finished off my brisket in the oven at 230 degrees Fahrenheit, and it took about 7.5 hours to get to the point where the internal temperature was 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And you want to check that by putting it right into the thickest part of the brisket and making sure it's up. But more important than the temperature is when you push it in, it should slide in just like it was going into butter. And this does. Now, if it didn't and had a little bit of resistance, I'd keep heating it up until it got hotter and then try it again every degree or two of internal temperature until it was really soft. Now, I can't tell you how long this is going to take to cook for every piece of meat. It depends on your smoker, whether you're doing it in the oven, the amount of direct heat versus indirect heat, how much fat there is in the beef, a whole myriad of things. It can change a couple of hours easily. But it's not a problem because once you've cooked a brisket, it really is better if you let it rest. So I planned on having this at 6, and I put it on at 4 in the morning for 14 hours of time. And it's now only 3:30, so I've got 2.5 hours to go till dinner. But that's not a problem because we're going to let it rest. And if you let it rest by getting a camp icebox type cooler and then put a towel in the bottom of it, just like that, and then put your brisket, it's hot, so be careful, on the towel. Seal it up good with the foil and put another towel on top of it. It'll stay hot like this for 3-4 hours, no problem at all. So we're just going to close the cooler up and let our brisket rest until dinner time. When we cut it up, I'll come back and show you how tasty it is. The brisket rested in the foil for about 2.5 hours. And it's still really hot, and you can see it's jiggly, which is what you want it to look like. And I've taken it out of the foil, and I took the juice out of the foil and saved it, because if you pour that over or dip the slices in it after you cut the roast up, it is absolutely delicious. Now, because there's two parts of meat that run in different directions, you can't just slice this up, because this point runs that way, and this flat runs this way. So what some people do is they actually cut the flat off and separate it, but I find that to be a bit of pain for just a basic at-home brisket. So what I do is I go to the thick end and I come back about 1/3 of the way down and I cut through there. And you'll see that what we have is an incredibly moist piece of brisket. So I take the point and I set it aside, because we're going to cut it in this direction, and we're going to take the flat, which is the leaner part, and we're going to cut it against the grain. So you want to, it's really soft, so you want to cut it about pencil thickness, just so it doesn't fall apart. So we'll just start slicing into our brisket. Look at that beautiful smoke ring. It is just gorgeous. And you'll see that it's incredibly tender. You can just pull it apart. It barely even needs a knife. But of course, the most critical part is to taste it. So we'll take a taste of the flat first. That's as tender as butter. It's really moist. It's got a great seasoning flavor from the rub. That is absolutely marvelous. But let's give our point a try. Now this is going to be really fatty. And I suspect most wives would smack me on the head and shoulders, but it is a really nice cut because it is so fatty, it's really juicy. So again, we'll cut about pencil thick slices off. And Let's try a fatty piece from the point. So incredibly juicy with that fat all ribbon through it. It just tastes magnificent. So as you can see, making a brisket is so easy that you can make it.
In this episode, David made basic brisket. The ingredients used were 1 pack of brisket, 15 milliliters of pepper, and 9 milliliters each of salt, beef base, paprika, onion powder, and garlic powder, 175 milliliters of beef stock, and 50 milliliters of soy sauce. For the complete recipe, visit David's blog at oldfatguy.ca. And remember, you can make it. It's time to make it. Just give it a try. 'Cause you can make it like the old fat guy.
Thanks for watching this episode of You Can Make It. Today the old fat guy is going to make beef ribs. Now this is just a basic beef rib recipe that you can do in the smoker. If you don't have a smoker, you can do it in a 225 degree oven, but it just won't be the same. It won't have the nice crusty coating from the smoke, won't have the taste, but it will be delicious. So how do I do basic beef ribs? Well, first you get some ribs. What I have here is 1.5 kilograms, or about 3 pounds of beef ribs. Now these happen to be prime beef ribs, and the problem with them is that it comes off the same part as the prime rib roast, and butchers get a lot of money for that, so they cut them quite lean. They haven't done too bad a job here. There's some meat in there, but they did do a couple of starting cuts, which I don't appreciate, but you take what you get from the butcher. To get the ribs started, I'm going to give them a rub. We're just doing a basic rub today, and what I have here is 6 milliliters, or 1.25 teaspoons each, of kosher salt, coarse ground pepper, onion powder, and garlic powder. In the smoking world, it's affectionately known as spog for obvious reasons. So I'm just going to sprinkle that mixture over my ribs. Put half on each side. Make sure you get the ends. And last a little bit on these ends. And then this has got to go into the smoker, but you want to let it sit for about 15 minutes for that rub to set on there. Then it's going to go into a 225 degree smoker. So I'll see you outside in a couple of minutes. So I'm out here at my smoker, and I'm just going to put the ribs in. There we go. And they're going to stay in there for 3 hours at 225 degrees Fahrenheit. And every half hour, I'm just going to give them a spray with some apple juice. What that does is put some liquid, sweet liquid on, which makes a nicer bark or crust on it. And also liquids take in the smoke. Smoke is water soluble, so you'll get a bit more smoke on the surface of the ribs in the 3 hours. I'll see you back in about 3 hours. So the ribs were in the smoker for 3 hours. And as you can see, they got a beautiful red color to them and a nice crust on them. That's called the bark. And now we're going to wrap them up in foil. When you cook them, at first you're trying to get that bark on it. Going to wrap them in foil so moisture develops and helps softens the ribs up. So that's this next step. So we'll just wrap them up here. Just try and get them nice and tight. There we go. So these ribs have to go back into the heat for another 2 hours to let that moisture soften up the meat. Now, these are prime ribs, and they're pretty tender to begin with, but they have a lot of fat, so it also gets the fat to render and go into the meat. The great thing about this method is it can be used for prime ribs, for regular long beef ribs, or for the blade ribs or short ribs, which have a lot more meat on them. It works fine for all of them. So I'm just going to put this in the smoker for another 2 hours. Because it's in foil, it's not going to get any more smoke on it. You could even put it in a 225-degree oven for 2 hours. But I'm going to put it in the smoker just because it's a nice day and I want to be outside. I'll see you in a couple of hours. So the beef ribs have been in the foil for 2 hours at 225 degrees Fahrenheit. So what we're going to do is just take them out of the foil. Be careful doing this because it's going to have hot steam coming out. And we'll just lift them up and take them right out of the foil. There we go. And put them on the grill. Now that we've got them out of the foil, we want to put some sauce on them. So you can use any barbecue sauce you like with beef. Just make your own or buy some commercial. But put a layer of barbecue sauce over both sides of the ribs. Okay, now that we've done that side, we're just going to give them a flip and do the other side. Now, what I'm going to do is leave these go in the heat for another 10 minutes to get the sauce to start to set. Then I'm going to give it another brushing with sauce and another 10 minutes, and then our ribs should be done. So I'll see you inside in about 20 minutes. So I gave the ribs a brush of sauce, cooked them for 10 minutes, gave them a second brush of sauce, cooked them for another 10 minutes. Now they're done. Now I let them rest for 5 to 10 minutes just to let the juices go between them. But let's see how they look. You can see they're nicely glazed, got a wonderful color. We'll just cut one of them off. And if you look at the meat here, you'll see it's got a wonderful red smoke ring and it's incredibly juicy. So let's have a taste. Just cut some of the meat off. Oh, it's fork tender, folks, let me tell you. That has a big beefy taste that you only get from beef ribs. It's got a nice moisture, it's got a great crust on the outside, really tender on the inside. That is a great beef rib. The sauce just gives it a touch of sweet, which I like. You just couldn't make better beef ribs, but guess what? You can make it.
In this episode, David made basic beef ribs. The ingredients used were 1.5 kilograms of beef ribs and 6 milliliters each of salt, pepper, onion powder, and garlic powder. Also, 75 milliliters of barbecue sauce. For the complete recipe, visit David's blog at oldfatguy.ca. And remember, you can make it.